This wound that was created over the last 400 years is absolutely huge. We are trying to pave a way and trying to be part of a campaign to persuade bigger institutions, the government and maybe even the royal family to apologise and to engage in reparative negotiations.
Hey there, Breakdown family. There's a wound that's never really healed. Across the Black world, from Ghana to Grenada, from Jamaica to Jackson, Mississippi, our communities still carry the weight of a crime that was never fully acknowledged, never fully repaired, and never truly atoned for. We're talking about slavery, colonialism, exploitation. You see, generations were stolen, wealth was extracted, and while the chains may have come off, the systems built on our suffering, they're still standing, and they're still costing our communities. For years, Black leaders have been calling for reparations, demanding justice. And for years, the response from colonial powers has been silence, crickets, no real compensation, just carefully worded statements and symbolic gestures. But something happened recently that cracked open a new kind of conversation. Because for the first time, the descendants of slave owners, people whose families built their wealth on the back of slaves, stood before the United Nations and said, "This was wrong. We benefited from it. And now it's time to make it right." Not behind closed doors, not in whispers, but in front of the entire world. This wasn't just an apology. It was a challenge, a turning point, a moment that said, maybe, just maybe, this fight isn't ours to carry alone anymore. So today on The Breakdown, we're unpacking what's happening, what it means, what it could lead to, and why we still have to stay sharp. Yes, because symbolic acts without structural change, without real impact, real result, are not enough. But if this is the start of something real, then we need to pay attention and we need to keep pushing. But before we dive in, I want to invite you to be a part of something bigger. See, here at Panagenius TV, we're building more than just a channel. We're creating a global home for Black stories that are told with truth, intention, and power. And if that speaks to you, hit subscribe, tap the bell, drop your super thanks, and consider joining our membership community where you will get exclusive videos and behind the scenes conversations and the chance to be a part of the dialogue shaping our future. This isn't just content, no, it's a movement, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. All right, now let's get into it. So to understand the power of what happened at the UN, you have to understand who is speaking and what they represent. Charlie Gladstone is the 19th great-grandson of 19th century British Prime Minister William Gladstone. He said he discovered about 7 years ago that William Gladstone's father, Sir John Gladstone, was one of the largest slave owners in the British West Indies. In fact, he was the single largest payout from Britain's slavery compensation scheme.
It is with deep shame and regret that we acknowledge our ancestors' involvement in this crime, and with heartfelt sincerity that we apologise to the descendants of the enslaved in Guyana.
And former BBC journalist Laura Trevelyan said she learned after records of Britain's Slave Compensation Commission were put online in 2013 that one of her ancestors, Sir John Trevelyan, owned sugarcane plantations in Grenada and about 1,000 enslaved people.
Yeah, so what happened is in 2013 in Britain, University College London published a database which showed the compensation which was paid to all of the people who owned slaves when slavery was abolished in Britain in 1833, which might seem like a head scratcher. Why did the owners of the enslaved get compensation and not the enslaved? But the answer is that was the only way that Britain could get abolition through Parliament, where there were many lawmakers who were themselves plantation owners in the West Indies. So this database of the 46,000 individuals who were paid compensation in 1834, the year after abolition, was published online in 2013, and immediately the database crashed. People logged into it. It couldn't stand the volume, as you can imagine. And then in about 2016, somebody in my family who had idly typed Trevelyan into this database emailed me, because I was supposed to be the family historian. I had written a book in 2006 about family history, which, by the way, had nothing of this in it because I didn't know. And this cousin emailed and said, "Oh my gosh, Laura, you won't believe it. Do you know that it says in the database that the Trevelyans got compensation for 6 different plantations in Grenada, and that we owned more than 1,000 slaves at the time of abolition? Did you know that?" And I said, "No, I had no idea." And this cousin said, I'm shocked, I'm appalled. This has changed my whole vision of our family. It's terrible. Yeah. What do you think?
And now, for the first time, both Charlie and Laura sat with descendants of enslaved people in former British colonies in the Caribbean at the same table at the United Nations, with diplomats and experts from those nations discussing the need for reparation. Now, Laura raises a point that we still grapple with today. When slavery was abolished, it wasn't the enslaved, it wasn't the slave owners, but rather the enslavers who were compensated. That's right. The British government paid out the equivalent of billions in today's dollars to the people who owned human beings for reparations. That money, it helped build mansions, businesses, and generational wealth. It helped shape the British elite. And some of that wealth, well, it landed directly in the pockets of the Trevelyan and Gladstone families.
And then I thought, this is shocking and it's appalling. And then I thought, that's a real story there for some point. Nora Ephron, the American screenwriter, said that all life is copy. And so I thought, this is a story that someday I have to look at it, I have to think about it. And then came 2020, and that summer, and living here in New York City, covering Black Lives Matter, the reaction to the death of George Floyd, so many protests right here in Brooklyn where I live. And then I really was forced to think that if a legacy of slavery in America is police violence towards Black men, then what does this mean? That my family, my ancestors, were slave owners in Grenada, not that far from where I am now.
Laura spent decades as a journalist at the BBC, but after learning the full truth of her family's history, plantations in Grenada, nearly 1,000 people enslaved, she wanted to do more. She said, "I can't just report the news anymore. I have to be part of repairing the harm." So she pitched a story to the BBC team, picked up a camera, and set off to Grenada to tell this story.
And then this was something that was worth doing. And my commissioning editor at the BBC, Hugh Levinson, said, "Laura, if we're going to send you, you have to ask the question, should I pay reparations? You can't go unless you damn well ask that question of everyone you meet in Grenada." And so then I got to go with a fantastic young Haitian-American producer, Coralie Barreau, herself a descendant of the enslaved in Haiti. And so we went on this journey together to Grenada last year.
What was it like when you landed? What went through your mind? What was it like?
Really extraordinary. The first thing that we did was land and go to Beausejour, which is one of the largest former sugarcane plantations on the island. A beautiful location with a huge plantation house. It's not the original house, but it looks like something from the movies, what you would think a sugarcane plantation would look like, with a huge house on the hill, these sloping hills, ancient buildings where the sugarcane factories were. And I looked at this place, which was once so beautiful and so terrible, and I felt a shiver going down my spine. And you could just imagine the picture with the slave master in the big house with the enslaved at the bottom of these slopes. And it was so hot, Michelle, so hot. And just thinking of people toiling away and the machetes. And I met there DC Campbell, who's a Grenadian historian, lives in the US now. And I met DC there, and he said, Laura, think of it. here we are in beau séjour, me a descendant of the enslaved and you a descendant of slave owners. Think of that. But the weight of the moment just really hit both of us under that blue Caribbean sky and that hot sun, and it was like we were back up 200 years.
And Charles Gladstone, he also stood up, acknowledging a deep guilt because he realizes that his privilege, his position in society is because of that suffering. They didn't have to do this. No, they could have stayed quiet like most people. But instead, they chose to use their names, their platforms, and their inherited power to influence change. They're not pretending to be heroes. They're not asking for praise. They're asking governments to act. They're asking institutions to repair. They're asking history to be faced with honesty and not just by the descendants of the enslaved. And that's powerful, because if those who benefited most from injustice finally speak up, then maybe the world has to start listening.
This is part of Britain's past, and part of Britain's wealth that was accumulated here in these sugarcane plantations of the Caribbean, and that it's unacknowledged, really. I think that was what hit me, is so few British people are taught the extent of the slave trade and the legacy of it as well. The fact that this was a system of wealth extraction, that was what we talked about that afternoon, was how the enslaved got absolutely nothing when slavery ended, apart from they had to work for free, a system of apprenticeship. That was also part of the deal in Britain's parliament, that not only did the slave owners get compensation, but their workforce were referred to as apprentices and had to work for them for free for another few years. So then the Caribbean is left with this legacy of illiteracy, of poverty at emancipation. So there was just so much that I learnt when I was there about how the past does inform the present.
The past sure does inform the present. But what I like about Laura's story is it doesn't just end there with an acknowledgement and amplifying the legacy of slavery. She took action.
So Hilary Beckles, the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission and the preeminent intellectual in the Caribbean, author of Britain's Black Debt, which is a really excellent book about the debt that Britain owes the Caribbean. So he's really one of the authors of CARICOM's 10-point reparations plan. And that plan begins with, and this is a request, by the way, to the former colonial powers. It's not a request to individual families like my own, but nonetheless, we used it as a guide. Point number one is an apology, the importance of an apology. And then CARICOM's reparations plan calls for debt relief and investment in health and education, because these, with the wealth extraction, there was no chance to invest in health or education. The Caribbean nations have been playing catch up forever. So we use this as a bit of a model and a guide for ourselves, and we worked with Grenada's National Reparations Committee, and Nicole Philip Dow, who was the vice chair of that committee. I worked closely with her and with Sir Hilary to try to figure out what was the best thing to do, and talk to many family members, and we tried to hurdle. You can imagine what that's like. 104 family members signed our letter of apology that we delivered in Grenada. But not all 104 family members really have very much money or are in a position to give. So people are giving what they can. I myself are giving £100,000. And we settled on education. And the University of the West Indies has a bursary fund in Grenada for mature students. So that's something we're giving money to, and also to a rural charity for school children in Grenada, which helps with the cost of getting to school buses and school supplies, because these seemed like very practical things. And if one of the legacies of enslavement was illiteracy and the education gap, then this seemed like something that it was important to fund.
Now let's be honest. When wealthy white descendants of slave owners offer an apology and a donation, especially from the comfort of institutions built on Black suffering, it's very easy to ask, is this real? Or is it just for show? Because we've seen this movie before. But this moment, Laura and Charles standing before the United Nations felt different, because they weren't just saying, our families are so sorry. They were saying, our governments should pay. We should pay. Now, is that enough? No, absolutely not. Because reparations aren't charity. They're not about generosity. They're about justice. And justice doesn't stop with a donation or an apology from a single family. It requires systems to be transformed. So here's what CARICOM, the political and economic body representing 15 Caribbean nations, is asking for. They've demanded a full formal apology from colonial governments, debt cancellation, since much of the region's current debt traces back to colonial underdevelopment, massive investment in health, education, and technology to close the gaps created by centuries of exploitation, and yes, direct financial compensation. We're not talking about handouts here. We're talking about repairing stolen wealth, stolen labor, and stolen futures. And that's where this moment becomes powerful. And if it becomes contagious. Because if more families, more politicians, more institutions start stepping up this way, not just with apologies, but with action, then maybe, just maybe, we move from gestures to justice.
Yeah, for sure. And when we went to Grenada, that question was asked a lot. You know, this isn't very much money, is it? £100,000 when your ancestors got £3 million when slavery was abolished, plus earned who knows how much from the sale of sugarcane over maybe 80 to 100 years. And the answer is that, you know, no amount of money can possibly be enough for the horror, to compensate for the horror of what happened. And, you know, enslavement in the Caribbean resulted in the population dropping. The number of Africans who were shipped from West Africa to the Caribbean, there was no natural population growth. There was a population decline because of the brutality and the hideous conditions. So money can't make up for that. But what I hope, and yes, you're right, the sort of attack comes from the left and the right. From the right, where will this end? You know, going to apologize for everything forever, and, you know, this was the past sort of thing. And then the left, well, this is just, you know, meaningless white savior, make privilege, PR, etc. But I think Sir Hilary Beckles persuaded us that if we became the first British family whose ancestors were slave owners to publicly apologize, he said, you will set an example, you will encourage others to follow, and you will help a little bit to fill that void that we have in the Caribbean where we don't know our history. All we know is that our ancestors were kidnapped from Africa and we were dumped in the Caribbean. But you're actually part of our history, and there's been a deafening silence from descendants of slave owners for obvious reasons. People are scared of the reaction. But it will be part of the healing process. Even though it will be painful and it will be turbulent, it's important to do it. And I've been contacted by a number of families since our apology, British families whose ancestors were slave owners in Jamaica, Guyana, Barbados, who've said, how did you do this? How can we do this? We want to acknowledge this painful past, but we don't know how. So can you help? And so I have said what we did. And in a way, in the Caribbean, it's quite straightforward, Michelle, because there are these reparations committees on all the islands in CARICOM. There are people that you can talk to who want to talk to you about it.
So why does what people like Laura and Charlie are doing matter? For decades, the push for reparations has come from the people who lost the most. From Caribbean leaders demanding compensation from Britain. From African nations still recovering from the economic scars of colonization. From African Americans calling out the unpaid debt of slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic exclusion. And let's be real, most of the time, those calls have been ignored, sidelined, or brushed off as too complicated. But when the people who benefited from slavery, people whose families built wealth on Black backs, stand up and say, we agree, reparations are necessary, and we're using our privilege to support the demand. That hits different because whether we like it or not, this world often listens more to power than to pain. Now, let's be clear. This is not about letting former oppressors lead the movement, right? The people most harmed should always be the ones shaping what justice looks like. But we do need allies, especially the ones sitting inside systems that still hold power. When descendants of slave owners step forward, not to center themselves, but to amplify the call for repair, it sends a message to governments, to corporations, and institutions that have spent generations pretending that this conversation doesn't exist. You don't get to be silent anymore. This moment won't solve everything. It won't erase centuries of trauma or balance centuries of stolen wealth, but it could open doors. It could build bridges. It could shift the weight of this fight from being one-sided to something closer to justice. Because, my people, real justice requires more than just the oppressed calling for change. It requires those who inherited the benefits of oppression to help dismantle the systems that built their privilege. So here's the truth. The burden of this fight was never supposed to fall on Black people alone. And now that others are finally stepping in, whether it's through guilt, conscience, or courage, we have to make sure the conversation doesn't get diluted, but amplified. This is our moment to push harder, to demand more, to turn symbolic gestures into structural transformation. So here's my question for you. Do you think this moment brings us closer to real reparations? Or is it just another symbol in a world that's too comfortable with injustice? And what does justice actually look like to you? Is it money, apologies, development, land, debt forgiveness? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if this episode moved you, don't just scroll past. Hit subscribe, tap that bell, and consider joining our membership community for thinkers, truth seekers, and builders of a new future. Because the breakdown isn't just a show, it's a movement. And your support helps us stay independent and unapologetic. So that's it for today's show. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, take care. Hey you! Thanks so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe and join the family. Also, visit face2faceafrica.com for your daily news and updates on what's going on within the global Black community so you can stay informed.